Hello, my name is Emily Collins, and in this presentation, I will examine the 22 high leverage practices in special education and demonstrate how I plan to apply each practice in my future classroom. The practices are organized across 4 connected domains, which are collaboration, assessment, social, emotional, and behavioral practices in instruction. Together, they describe the professional actions that special educators use repeatedly to improve access, participation, independence, and meaningful student outcomes. Okay, so HLP 1 summary. HLP 1 focuses on collaboration with professionals. Effective collaboration is more than sharing updates or working in the same room. The team combines its expertise, studies student data, and makes coordinated decisions about instruction and support. Clear roles are especially important because a strong plan can still fail when team members use different prompts, expectations, or data procedures. In my classroom, collaboration will remain centered on measurable student outcomes, while every professional's knowledge and perspective will be treated as valuable. For example, I would hold a brief weekly huddle of sorts with the general education teacher, speech language pathologist, and paraprofessional supporting a student who uses an AAC. We would review participation data and choose one shared target, like independently requesting help or a break during 3 daily routines. Each adult would leave with a specific responsibility for modeling, prompting, and recording responses. At the end of the week, we could examine the data together and decide whether to continue, to fade the prompts, or adjust the plan in some way. This keeps support consistent instead of depending on whatever adult is present. Just keeps everyone on the team on the same page. Okay, HLP2. HLP2 addresses how teachers organize and facilitate meetings. IEP, transition, family, and instructional planning meetings should have a clear purpose and should lead to measurable decisions for the student. Effective facilitation includes preparing an agenda, managing the time, encouraging honest participation, and explaining information in an accessible language. It also requires careful attention to nonverbal communication and power differences so that families and students are genuine partners. The meeting is not complete until decisions, responsibility, and next steps are understood by everyone on the team. Okay, so in an IEP meeting, I would send a plain language agenda ahead of time and ask the family what they most want to discuss. I would begin with the strengths of their student, then use a simple visual to explain progress. After each major section, I would pause and ask the student and family whether the proposed goal reflects their priorities. Before closing, I would restate the decisions, identify who's responsible for each action, and provide a written summary with the next review date. This structure would help keep the meeting organized while protecting space for meaningful participation for all parties. HLP3. HLP3 emphasizes sustained collaboration with families. Families contribute knowledge that cannot be captured by a school assessment alone, including the student's history, culture, communication, interests, routines. Teachers must explain rights and special education processes clearly. Listen without assuming that the school priorities should automatically come first, and help families access needed services. So, application of HLP3. If a family identifies morning independence as a priority, for example, I would ask which part of the routine creates the greatest barrier. Together, we might design a visual sequence for packing a bag and checking needed items. I would use the family's preferred communication method to share brief progress updates and ask what is working at home. Okay, HLP 4. HLP 4 requires teachers to use multiple sources of information to understand a student. A standardized test score may label something as concerning, but it rarely explains why the concern exists or what instruction should look like. A comprehensive profile combines formal and informal measures, work samples, observations, family and student input, and information about the learning environment. Teachers must also consider whether language, culture, access, or opportunity to learn affected performance. The goal is a balanced picture that includes strengths as well as needs. So, HLP 4 in application. Before concluding that a student has reading comprehension difficulty, I would collect curriculum-based probes, writing, and reading samples, observations during different lesson formats, and the student's own explanation of what feels difficult. I'd ask the family and general educator what they notice across settings. Then I would examine access factors such as vocabulary demands, hearing, vision, language, or just an unfamiliar task format. I would summarize the converging evidence in a learner profile, making the instructional decision just more accurate, but also more equitable. HLP 5. HLP 5 focuses on interpreting and communicating assessment information. Special educators need to understand an assessment's purpose, the meaning of its scores, and the limits of the conclusions that can be drawn. They must then translate that information into clear language and invite stakeholders to help interpret it. Culture and language matter because the same performance may have different explanations in different contexts. So HLP 5's application. I would present a one-page display that shows the target skill, the student's current performance, the trend over time, and an example from class. I would explain what the measure captures and what it does not capture, avoiding technical language whenever I can. Then I'd ask the student and family whether the pattern matches what they observe. Together, we would use this information to choose one measurable goal and identify the supports needed by the student. HLP 6. HLP 6 is the continuous use of assessment data to improve outcomes. One instruction or support begins. Teachers gather ongoing evidence and study the student's response. They also examine their own practice, including whether the plan was delivered consistently and whether the examples, pacing, grouping, or prompts were effective. Data should lead to a decision. HLP 6 application. If 3 weeks of word reading data show little growth, I would first verify that the intervention was implemented as intended. Then I'd analyze the student's errors, looking for a specific pattern. And based on that pattern, I might reduce the group size, increase teacher modeling, and add cumulative practice. Weekly probes would continue so I could compare to see if there's a new rate of improvement. Okay, now we are in social, emotional, and behavioral practices. Starting with HLP 7. HLP 7 centers on a consistent, organized, and respectful learning environment. Teachers establish routines and expectations that are positively stated, culturally responsive, and appropriate for the students' ages. These routines must be explicitly taught, practiced, reinforced, and retaught throughout the year. Respectful relationships and an organized physical and social environment reduce preventable behavior challenges and increase engagement. HLP 7 application. In my classroom, the arrival routine might include entering, checking a visual schedule, storing materials, selecting a regulation tool if needed, and beginning the first task. I'd teach and practice the sequence when students are calm rather than waiting for a difficult morning. Students would have age-respectful choices and access to a private reset space. HLP 8. HLP 8 focuses on positive and constructive feedback within the social, emotional, and behavioral domain. Feedback should be tied to a known goal, describe observable behavior, and give the student information that can guide the next response. Its timing and frequency should match the student's stage of learning. HLP 8 application. Suppose a student's goal is to request a break before leaving the work area. When the student selects break on the AAC system, I might say, "You selected break before walking away. That kept you safe and helped me understand." I'd honor the request and then use the planned return routine. HLP 9. HLP 9 treats social behaviors as content that can be explicitly taught. The teacher first determines whether the student lacks the skill or knows the skill but does not use it. Instruction can then include a clear definition, modeling, guided practice, prompts, feedback, and opportunities across settings. Replacement behavior also has to work for the student. HLP 9 application. To teach requesting a break, I would define what the behavior looks like and make sure the student can access it through speech, sign, a picture, or AAC. We would model and role-play the request during calm, low-stress moments. During instruction, I would prompt the skill at the earliest signs of frustration and then gradually fade these prompts. HLP 10. HLP 10 is the use of functional behavior assessments, or FBA, to develop individualized behavior support. The team defines the behavior in observable terms and gathers information about what happens before and after it, along with relevant setting events. The data support a hypothesis about the behavior's function. HLP 10 application. If a student's refusal consistently occurs during difficult writing and results in work being removed, the data might suggest an escape function. I'd teach the student an accessible way to request help or a brief break. I'd also offer choice, break the assignment into smaller sections, and make the finish point visible. HLP 11. HLP 11 asks teachers to identify and prioritize long and short-term learning goals. Special educators often face more possible needs that can be addressed with equal intensity. Priorities should be selected from standards, assessment data, learning progressions, prior knowledge, and IEP goals. The most valuable goals increase access, independence, participation, and readiness for future learning. HLP 11 application. For a student with extensive support needs, a meaningful long-term outcome might be independently following an adapted visual recipe in a community-based cooking task. I'd identify prerequisite skills such as safety vocabulary, quantity concepts, sequencing, tool use, and requesting help. Each prerequisite would become a measurable short-term goal, but the student would continue participating in the complete age-appropriate activity. HLP 12. HLP 12 focuses on systematic instructional design. Teachers begin with the intended learning outcome and analyze the concepts, component skills, prerequisites, misconceptions, and time needed to reach it. Lessons are sequenced so that each one builds on prior learning and makes connections explicit. The sequence is systematic but not inflexible. HLP 12 application. In a community purchasing unit, I would first connect prices and budgets to familiar items. The sequence would then teach students to locate a price, compare it with a budget, make a choice, pay, and check change. Each lesson would include cumulative practice with earlier steps so the skill is not taught in fragments. HLP 13. HLP 13 involves adapting curriculum tasks and materials for a specific learning goal. The teacher must first identify what students actually need to learn. Adaptations can change the amount of material, wording of directions, visual organization, technology, response mode, or emphasis on essential information. The critical question is whether the change removes an access barrier while preserving meaningful engagement with the target. HLP 14. HLP 14 addresses the cognitive and metacognitive strategies. Cognitive strategies help students perform tasks, while metacognitive strategies help them plan, monitor, and evaluate their own thinking. Teachers make these invisible processes visible through modeling, think-alouds, explicit prompts, and guided practice. Students should learn not only the steps of a strategy, but also when and why to use it. The ultimate goal is self-regulated learning and independence. HLP 14. I would teach the goal, plan, do, check for multi-step HLP 14. HLP 14 addresses cognitive HLP 14 application. I would teach goal, plan, do, check for multi-step classroom and life skill tasks. First, the student defines what a successful finished product would look like. Then, they would need to identify materials, steps, supports, and the order in which to do the steps in. At the end, the student compares the result with their original goal and decides what they could do better next time. HLP 15. HLP 15 focuses on scaffolded supports. A scaffold is temporary assistance that enables a student to complete a task that is not yet independently accessible. Supports may be visual, verbal, written, physical, or technological, and some are planned while others are added responsively during instruction. Teachers must calibrate scaffolds to the learner's current performance and monitor whether they can actually help. HLP 15 application. During written response instruction, I might begin with a model, graphic organizer, sentence frame, and a word bank. After guided practice, I would collect information about both accuracy and independence. I would then remove just one support at a time, beginning with the support the student relies on the least. If performance drops sharply, I would restore it and redesign the scaffold rather than assuming the student is unmotivated. The objective is stable success while gradually decreasing support. HLP 16. HLP 16 is explicit instruction. The teacher states a clear objective, breaks complex learning into manageable steps, models both actions and thinking, and selects examples and non-examples that reveal the important distinctions. Students receive guided practice, frequent checks for understanding, and immediate feedback before moving toward independence. HLP 16 application. To teach main idea, for example, I'd first model how I notice repeated ideas and distinguish a broad topic from a complete main idea statement. During guided practice, we would analyze a short passage together using response cards and targeted questions. Students would then identify the main idea independently and support it with 2 details. If errors show that students are choosing interesting details instead of central ideas, then I would add a carefully selected example and non-example before continuing on. HLP 17. Use flexible seating. Flexible grouping. HLP 17 addresses flexible grouping. Teachers use both similar need and mixed strength groups depending on the learning purpose. Effective groups have tasks that genuinely require collaboration, accessible ways for each student to participate, and procedures for individual accountability. Teachers monitor academic interaction and provide feedback rather than assuming that placing students together creates a productive learning environment. HLP 17 application. Within one literacy block, I might use a brief skill check to form a temporary decoding group for direct instruction. A separate mixed strength group could discuss comprehension with assigned roles and multiple response options. I might also meet individually with a student who needs intensive fluency practice. I would review data each week and reorganize the groups. HLP 18. HLP 18 focuses on active student engagement. Engagement grows from positive relationships, relevant content, and frequent opportunities to respond. Teachers can combine choral responses, response cards, cooperative learning, peer tutoring, self-monitoring, and technology-supported participation. Engagement is not the same as quiet behavior or visual attention. Teachers need to observe actual responding and adjust instruction when students are not meaningfully processing the content. HLP 18 application. For example, in a 10-minute lesson, I'd begin with a relevant question and accept responses through speech, writing, gesture, or AAC. During modeling, students might use response cards or choral responding. A short partner teach back would give each student a defined role, followed by an individual application. I would use those responses to decide whether to move forward or to reteach. HLP 19. HLP 19 is the purposeful use of assistive and instructional technologies. Selection begins with the learner, the tasks, the environment, and not with the newest tool. Teachers consider AAC, instructional technology, and universal design for learning to increase access, communication, participation, and independence. Effective implementation includes teaching the student to team to use the tool, planning for consistency and backups, and measuring whether it improves meaningful outcomes for the student. HLP 19 application. If a student's ideas are much stronger than their handwriting and spelling output, I would trial word prediction, text-to-speech review, and speech-to-text. I would explicitly teach each tool instead of assuming the student will learn it independently. Across authentic assignments, I'd compare writing quality, completion time, errors, and independence. We would choose the least complex option that meaningfully reduces the barrier and maintain a low-tech backup. HLP 20. HLP 20 involves intensive instruction for students with significant or persistent needs. Intensity may include a smaller group, more time, a narrower focus, more opportunities to respond, more systematic explicit teaching, and more frequent progress monitoring. The instruction remains concentrated on a small number of high-priority skills, but most importantly, it becomes increasingly individualized through diagnostic evidence. HLP 20 application. For a student with persistent decoding difficulty, I might provide daily instruction in a group of 1 or 2 students, focusing on one narrow phonics pattern with a cumulative review. The students would have many opportunities to respond and receive immediate corrective feedback. Daily error notes and a weekly probe would reveal the exact breakdown. If growth remains limited, I might adjust pacing, modeling, contrast, or prompt level. HLP 21. HLP 21 focuses on maintenance and generalization. A student may perform a skill during a familiar lesson but not use it later, elsewhere, or with a different person. Teachers therefore plan varied examples, materials, communication partners, and settings from the beginning. Artificial prompts and reinforcement are faded while naturally occurring cues and outcomes are strengthened. HLP 21 application. To generalize a purchasing skill, I'd begin in a classroom store, but vary the products, prices, and people acting as cashier. The student could then practice in the cafeteria during a supervised community trip. Teacher prompts would gradually fade as the student learned to use natural cues such as price labels and cashier questions. I would check performance after 1 week, 1 month, and then later in the term. Success means the skill works in real contexts without constant teacher direction. HLP 22. HLP 22 returns to positive and constructive feedback, now situated within instruction. Feedback should be anchored to a known learning goal and to evidence in the student's work. It confirms what is effective, identifies a manageable next step, and arrives soon enough for the student to use it. The amount and frequency change across acquisition, fluency, and maintenance. Over time, teacher feedback should help students develop their own capacity to evaluate and improve their performance. HLP 22 application. During writing, I might say, your topic sentence clearly states the claim. Now add evidence from paragraph 3 to explain how it supports that claim. The student would revise immediately and compare the change with a short rubric. As the student becomes more skilled, I would ask them to identify the successful feature and next step before I comment. In this way, feedback becomes part of an independent revision process rather than a judgment delivered after the learning opportunity has passed. Okay, these 22 practices are presented separately so that each can be learned, practiced, and improved, but their greatest value is found in how they work together. In my future classroom, I will use the HLPs as an integrated framework for reflective, evidence-informed, and student-centered teaching. Thank you for listening.